Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. This episode is going to be a fun one. We're going to talk about ways in which Operation Barbarossa could have gone differently.
So just to start out with a brief history lesson, Operation Barbarossa starts on June the 22nd of 1941. Germany and its allies in Eastern Europe invade the Soviet Union, setting off perhaps in itself maybe the bloodiest war of all time.
Of all time, yeah.
If it's just a war on its own, just if you took the Eastern Front away from anything else. Basically, long story short, is the Germans wreak a lot of havoc on the Soviets, capture tremendous amounts of troops, make huge headway as they drive three main army groups, north, center, and south. Basically, at a certain point, they're sort of all driving on independent axes, but sort of the focus becomes more towards driving towards Kiev in the south in the around September, October, and eventually after capturing Kiev, they drive north again towards Moscow. And by December of 1941, the Germans basically are stopped at the gates of Moscow itself. Supposedly, some German soldiers said they could see the top of the Kremlin. Mm-hmm. But the best general of all in Russia, General Winter, stops them dead in their tracks in a Soviet counterattack in early to mid-December, using Siberian troops. Sort of throws the Germans back, and will begin the long process of expelling the Germans from Russia and the Soviet Union. But Barbarossa is a really interesting topic to discuss, I think, because there is a lot that could have that led up to it, or a lot that could have changed, and a lot of it could have changed even several years before.
Right.
That really get us to that point.
Yeah, but I mean, just talking about like in the immediate, right before the operation happened, I mean, Stalin had no clue this was going to happen. I've heard that he had no clue because I heard that he had like dozens and dozens and dozens of warnings from like spies, from, just common sense, and didn't really pay attention to it, or at least that's how it was presented to me.
Yes, no, absolutely. There was plenty of information coming in through the Soviet intelligence service, through spies, and through just reconnaissance. I mean, the number of German and other troops, Hungarian, Romanian troops, Slovakian troops that were building up, there's just no way that couldn't have been noticed by Soviet troops on their frontiers. And remember, though, that a big chunk of the frontier that the Soviets had was actually occupied Eastern Poland, that they'd occupied in 1939 when they invaded. So they already have, they're sort of already on alert because the area they're in wasn't part of the Soviet Union until 1939. They were saying, reconnaissance flights were showing huge troop buildups. You can't ignore it. You just can't ignore it. But Stalin did.
He absolutely did. And it's funny, too, because when the operation happened, he had a mental breakdown. Mm-hmm. And for several days, he was indisposed. And when they actually basically forced him to go back to work, he thought that they were walking in the room to purge him, to kill him, and somebody else was going to take over. But nope, nobody else wants to be in charge. So Joseph, you're stuck with it.
But so Barbarossa itself is really, the Soviets put up tough fights at certain points, some really large battles. A whole lot of it sort of gets ignored. I mean, what definitely is certainly remembered is that most of the Soviet Air Force was caught on the ground and destroyed. Mm-hmm. And I remember, I think Andrew Roberts said about how the head of the Soviet bomber fleet, after that happened, made a very sensible career move and shot himself. In Stalin's Russia, that was a very sensible move sometimes. Mm-hmm. But basically, the Soviets fought hard, but were just caught so so off kilter. And the Germans, this is sort of the perfection of the Blitzkrieg style warfare. Even though certain equipment the Soviets had were better than what the Germans had. I mean, the T-34 tank actually was in use in June of 1941. It was better on its own than any German tank out there. But tactics is what's different, because you can have a great weapon, but if it's not used correctly, or if someone has inferior weapons but uses them with superior tactics, they can triumph over you.
Not to mention, a lot of German tanks were plagued by mechanical problems, breakdowns, a lack of fuel. Oh, yeah. What is it? Couldn't the Tiger not drive over bridges?
They could, but also remember the Tiger is not in service in June of 1941. The Tiger will not be used. Sure. I think the first time a Tiger was used is September or August of 1942 outside of Leningrad. So the best tank that the Germans have at this point is the Panzer IV. And I don't even know if the long-barreled Panzer IV was in service in June of 41. But either way, the Panzer III was the basis of what the Germans were using there. But either way, as the Germans saw incredible successes, but almost too much. I mean, they captured something like over 1 million prisoners of war.
Oh yeah, and it's insane how many they captured.
Yeah, just in and also as they drive across these areas, and they got to, so in the north, Leningrad obviously is the shortest drive from East Prussia and northern Poland. So they reached the gates of Leningrad by September, and the siege of the city began, and the siege wouldn't be lifted entirely until January of 1944. Yeah. And then obviously I talked about the move to the south with Kiev, and finally the drive north to Moscow. But Barbarossa poses some really interesting questions because a whole lot of stuff could have gone very differently. And I think the first place to start off is that if there had never been a Sino-Soviet, excuse me, if there had never been a German-Soviet pact back in 1939, where would a German invasion be starting from?
Yeah, because like the pact basically drew the lines through Eastern Europe saying, okay, this is going to be in the Soviet sphere of influence, this is going to be in the German sphere of influence. So like all of the Baltics is Soviet. Finland was supposed to be Soviet, but that didn't really work out, did it?
Winter War.
They gave Bessarabia to the Soviets. And of course, the big thing is partitioning Poland between the two of them. So like, if there's no agreement with between the Soviets and the Germans, like what's going on? I mean,
well, the Germans would have had to conquer all of Poland on their own.
Yeah,
and they would have started farther east, I guess.
I mean, could they even do that all on their own? I mean, back in 1939,
probably would have taken a lot more time. No one was coming to Poland's aid.
Yeah,
excuse me. So, and then I think more to the point I was guessing is that, operationally, how could Barbarossa be different? And I think the biggest change, and certainly we wouldn't be the first people to talk about this, is what if the panzers kept moving on Moscow instead of turning south to Kiev?
Right.
And someone commented once about, remember though, if you do that, you leave this really big, long, exposed flank. Is that's exposed to attacks from the south from Soviet troops. And remember is that your tanks are going to be concentrated in your spearhead. You're going to have to rely on infantry to protect your flank. And the longer that flank gets, the more vulnerable it is.
Right.
But even again, let's say the panzers do drive on Moscow. They're still going to get there pretty late in the year, relatively late. October, maybe at the earliest. November, probably. Still getting cold. Probably snow by that point in Russia. And also, even if you capture Moscow, it's not the end.
Yeah.
Ask a guy named Napoleon about that.
It didn't work out so well for him. Burned it to the ground, and it didn't help him one bit.
Well, also, it extends your lines out so far that it probably, at some point, it either gives the Soviets a nice place to hit you with a pincer maneuver, cut off the head of the maneuver and capture the city itself, or that you may just even retreat from the city itself to tactically shorten your lines. And any fight to get into Moscow is going to cost you a lot. Because the defensive lines around Moscow would have been very tough, and then fighting your way into the city itself would have been pretty hellish.
Yeah, street to street and all that stuff.
But
and I mean, what's the tactical value of Moscow? Not much.
It's symbolic.
It's a propaganda victory.
Because the Soviets already had relocated and were anticipated that this could have happened, and they'd relocated a lot of their government to is it Kubiev? The name is escaping me at the moment. But they obviously could have relocated to cities farther east. I mean, the war would have gone on. I mean, yeah, maybe some people could argue maybe the Soviet government would have collapsed, but I don't think so. And to be perfectly frank, it gives the Soviets, because remember the Soviet non-aggression pact with the Japanese is still in place, so they can still bring those troops from Siberia for the counterattack. And if you're farther east of Moscow for the Germans, remember, that's even more miles that supplies have to go. And the winter is coming. I hate to put it like that, but it's, there's stories about German tanks in that first winter couldn't move because their gas froze solid in their engines. A solid block.
Huh.
I mean, that's how cold the Germans did not have winter clothing in preparation for this. And it doesn't matter if Moscow falls or not. They're not going to be, the Soviets probably would torch the place if they had to, rather than let it fall into the Germans' hands. So what do you think about it, Max? I've been talking enough.
Well, you mentioned like the Japanese, and sure, you could take some divisions from the east, but You have to keep in mind the Japanese are pretty notorious about sneak attacks and breaking treaties and whatnot, so you really couldn't trust them too much. Also, you mentioned all those Soviet POWs. Did you know that like hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs were like used as auxiliaries in like the German army? They were called Heavies.
Heavies, yeah. Ostbataillon.
Yeah.
It's interesting, in a lot of the German units that American troops fought initially in Normandy were Ostbataillon that were manning the defensive, that were manning some of those beach defenses were Russians or other types of soldiers. There's actually an interesting thing in the movie Saving Private Ryan. There's a scene after they get over the cliff, and there's these two guys like yelling in some language at them, trying to say something to them, and then the soldiers shoot them, and then like Tom Hanks is looking very like, and then they're like, looting their bodies, and the guy's like making fun of them who shot them, and then Tom Hanks is looking very stern at them. But if you hear it at first, it's going so fast you think they're saying something in German. Well, actually, they're talking in Czech.
Yeah.
And they're saying, we're Czechs, we're not Germans, and they shoot them anyway. Well, that is something that these Ostbataillon, I mean, there's a very famous picture of an Asian man in a uniform.
Yeah.
And it turned in a Wehrmacht uniform. And like they literally had, I think the story was he'd been captured at Kalkin Gol, who had been like a Korean who had been pressed into service by the Japanese, who then got captured at Kalkin Gol by the Soviets, was then pressed into service by the Soviets, captured around Kharkov in 1943 by the Germans, and then pressed into service as a Heavy in an Ostbataillon in Normandy, and was captured by American troops there. So I mean, it's really interesting to see the sort of that sort of thing. So, but they were also treated terribly by the Germans, the Soviet POWs.
They would also call them. Oh, go on.
Joseph Stalin's oldest son was captured by the Germans.
I heard about that. Yeah,
and he died while in captivity, supposedly during an escape attempt. Although the circumstances of his death, I believe Yakov Stalin, is still kind of shrouded in mystery. This German said we'll trade him for like so many German generals they ever captured, and Stalin was like, "Nope,
I'll pass."
Doesn't strike you as a particularly
sentimental
man.
Though he did like his daughter. There's a bunch of pictures of him and his daughter, and there's a picture where his daughter is sitting in Beria's lap.
Oh God!
And it's like, oh God, you know.
She died in like 2008. I remember when she died. She was living in the United States.
She defected.
She did.
Yeah.
Svetlana Alyeva, I think.
Alyeva. Was that his first or second wife?
That was his second wife.
Okay.
First wife died, and then second wife was the one that committed suicide. And
quote
I put
unquote.
that in quotes. And probably put it beyond him to kill someone by it. But yeah. So yeah, we're talking about basically what we're trying to say is that Barbarossa, I mean, it could have succeeded, but it would have been to succeed, there had been a lot to change. And also to get, I know this is probably someone who would comment this, so we'll just nip this one in the bud about what if they just started earlier, like in April? Like, why didn't they start earlier? They started earlier, they could get to Moscow before the winter. Well, Russia is notorious for really heavy spring rains.
The Rasputitsa.
The Rasputitsa. And, well, let's just say most of the roads in the Soviet Union in 1941 weren't exactly paved. So if you go too early, now you have to fight your way through mud. Mm-hmm. So there was a very narrow window in which the Germans thought it was appropriate to start their offensive. Barbarossa itself is fascinating because there hadn't been a military operation on that scale, complexity, and how daring it was. You could say, I mean, the stuff that they were attempting to achieve. But remember, that, I mean, if you can't, there's just no way you can conquer Russia. There's just not, I mean, what are you going to get to the Urals by the end of 1941? Like,
you know, in that book, Fatherland or whatever, it's very silly because it's set in the 1960s, but the German war against the Russians is still going on. Yeah. It's insane. Yeah. It's like they're still fighting in the Urals, like 20 years later. It's insane.
I mean, how it's just the amount, and remember the German army, while it had some, the Tiger tank and the Panther, those come later, not in 1941, all these things. There was only one fully mechanized army in World War II.
They were still using horses.
Yeah, and the only fully mechanized army was the U.S. Army. The German army relied incredibly heavily on horses.
That people walked.
Yes.
They walked.
I mean, outside of a motorized infantry division or a panzer division, so unless you were a panzer grenadier, a panzer tanker, themselves, or in a motorized infantry unit, you walked. I mean, the German army, like all infantry at the time, pretty much walked.
Yeah.
They used trains, and they walked, and they used horses to pull artillery. I mean, motorized, and maybe we're thrown off because, like, when the Americans first are, fighting the Germans or fighting them in North Africa, where pretty much everything was motorized. But those were the only types of divisions the Germans had, were had panzers and motorized infantry units, because you can't really use a horse very well in the desert.
You don't see a lot of horses in World War II media.
You don't, unless you see pictures of, like, the aftermath of the Falaise pocket, and you just see, like, dead horses that line like an entire road, all German.
Well, when I say media, I mean like movies and whatnot. I mean, there is Band of Brothers.
He shoots that horse. Yeah,
he shoots the guy on the horse. Shoots the horse.
But yeah, I mean, all armies were pretty much not mechanized. The only one that was fully mechanized was the U.S. Army. I mean, cavalry was still a thing that lots of armies used. The Soviets particularly liked it.
But people don't make fun of the Soviets for it the way they do the Poles.
Yeah, well, Poland got kind of a bad rap.
It really did get a bad rap. I mean, like we were kind of talking earlier about like what if Germany had to fight Poland alone? And I mean, Poland had a substantial army, like over 1 million men, I'm pretty sure. And they had their own tanks. Some of them were not so great. I was showing you some pictures. There's like a double turreted one, and not so good. But I mean,
more turrets doesn't make it better.
Like 1939, Germany's not in a great place to be fighting an all-out war against all of Poland just by itself.
Yeah.
But then again, you have to wonder, like, too, if there's no German-Soviet pact, like, what are the Soviets going to do in Poland? Are they going to try to take it all for themselves?
I don't know. Oh, jeez.
Like, I don't know.
I feel like the Germans would have invaded Poland just to prevent them from getting to the German frontier. I mean, remember, Eastern Berlin is pretty far east in Germany. Even then, even before Silesia and all that was taken over by Poland after the war. Like, I mean, that's dangerous for any regime there that have the Soviets, in Danzig, basically.
Yeah.
The free city of Danzig. People forget that. Danzig was actually not part. It was a free city during the interwar years, which is really weird to think.
Also, that East Prussia wasn't even connected to Germany.
You mean Kaliningrad?
Kaliningrad, of course.
Max, how could you?
Although
most of East Prussia is actually now in what's now Poland. So, like, if you want to go to the Wolfschanze, it's in Poland. It's like in the middle of nowhere in northeastern Poland. Yep. Königsberg, but that's like the old heart of the Teutonic Knights and all that.
Yeah,
East Prussia.
From when they would go on crusade against the
Slavs.
The Slavs, yeah.
But back to Barbarossa. A focus on, I mean, I think the Moscow thing we've talked very fully about. But I'm trying to think. Even if they didn't concentrate there, they concentrated farther in the south, like. I mean, yeah, they would have gotten to Kiev sooner, but the scope of Barbarossa, as ambitious as it is, it's just hard to see how the Germans can win. And Andrew Roberts said that there's three decisive things. Is it Roberts or Anthony Beevor? I can't remember. I forgive me, both of you. I forget which one it was, but one of them said like, actually, no, sorry, it was David Glantz, who is, if you want to listen to some interesting lectures about the Second World War and the Russian front on YouTube. There is like the premier lecture about it. It's like an hour and 30 minutes long. And he is he writes for the Slavic Military Quarterly or whatever. He basically is like the foremost expert on the Soviets in World War II. And he's got all these lectures on YouTube that you can just watch. And there's one that he does that he runs through like the 8 campaigns of the Eastern Front. And it's fantastic. And it's where I learned a whole lot about it. It's just incredible. And it was from a lecture from a few years ago. But he said that there's 3 main things about the war on the Eastern Front. 3 main battles, and they each signify something. The fact that the Germans don't win the Battle of Moscow means that Hitler will not win on the Eastern Front on his own terms. Stalingrad means that the Germans will lose the war on the Eastern Front. And Kursk means that this defeat will be complete in total. It will not be a negotiated peace, which I thought was really interesting.
That's really cool.
I mean, basically, historians are not over-exaggerating when they say the Germans lost the war on June the 22nd of 1941. I mean, by entering the war against the Soviets, you've doomed yourself. You just can't win that.
And they didn't have to start the war because Stalin was having no plan of going to war against the Germans anytime soon. Like he had plans to maybe be ready for war against the Germans in like the mid 1940s, late 1940s. So he was in no rush. So I guess catching him with his pants down was effective, but not effective enough.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing is that, though, I think war was inevitable because, basically the Soviet Union stood for everything that Nazi Germany wasn't, in the sense of like, I think that's how the Nazis sort of saw it, as like, we cannot coexist with these people.
But we can make treaties with them.
Yes, for that short term. But, this sort of like the ultimate reckoning, like Barbarossa, as soon as Hitler came to power, pretty much Barbarossa was like almost foretold. Like the whole idea is like, that was sort of one of the biggest things that drew the Nazis to power, was this sort of what their argument to the German people was, is like, this is our great enemy. Like, this is the enemy of German civilization, is the Soviet Union. It stands for everything. It stands for Jewish Bolshevism, this is the
Slavic race.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Like, I mean, I think Barbara, Andrew Roberts talks about how the thing that the Germans lose the Second World War, because whenever the actual military, what was in the good military interest of Germany versus what was in the good interest of the Nazi party ideology, when those things diverged, they always picked what was good for the ideology rather than militarily. So like invading Russia is a terrible idea. It just is. But like the Nazis were basically, via their ideology, that's what they were going to do. Like they had to. There was no way that they could coexist with them. So it was almost, Barbarossa is inevitable. Maybe the date, June 22nd, is not inevitable. But
here's a question for you. If Hitler died, sometime in 1939, but before, any of the preparations for Barbarossa really got into full swing, would Germany still go to war with Russia?
Depends on who's heading the country up. Is it Goering?
Yeah.
Is it Himmler?
Is it some...
Who knows? I mean, that's hard
aristocrat?
Is it? Oh, at that point, the deputy Führer was oh my goodness, I can see his face. The guy, Rudolf Hess, the guy who died in the 80s. Yeah,
the guy with the eyebrows.
Yeah, the one who flew on that bizarre mission to Scotland.
I got to tell you,
BF 110.
I've been reading that Turtle Dove, the War That Came Early book, and there's something very interesting that happens with Hess. Oh, I'll just say, very interesting.
He was the one that Hitler transcribed Mein Kampf to.
Really? In prison?
He also was the last person really of Hitler's inner entourage that survived. He was the last to die. He died in 1987, I think.
So
he was like in his early 90s.
Why did he escape execution? Because he just wasn't there?
He was captured. I think it was August of 41 is when he did his flight to Britain. So he was captured over Scotland. So I think he just... I guess, and also people within the Nazi regime said like Hess was kind of a figurehead. Like he wasn't, he didn't really wield any power. Like he had an office that had an important title, it seemed, but he didn't really do anything. Right. And he was increasingly sidelined in favor of people whose titles may have been lesser than his, but had had actually more power. I mean, like Himmler and stuff like that had a title that was lesser than his. Like it seemed like it would be like a lower down on the totem pole. But they had way more power. They wielded way more power. Hess was still tried, but he was sentenced to life. And he was actually, at one point, the last person to be held in Spandau prison. The whole prison was kept open just for him. Huh. And then he died while he was there. Although, to this day, there's people who've made arguments that he was actually killed by the Soviets.
Really?
93. He was 93 when he died, I believe, so...
Like, why? He's an old man. Like, why? I don't know. Just for the sake of killing him?
Because he was the last real living link to the Nazi. I mean, there's people who were, who knew Hitler or who survived, who were in the bunker and stuff like that, who lived long after that. In fact, I think the last person who was in the Hitler bunker died in like 2013 or something like that. So something along those lines. But the last person who actually wielded some sort of power and was in sort of the inner entourage of the Third Reich was Hess, and he was that sort of last symbol. So so I guess, I don't know.
Wasn't he like not very
right?
Not very great, but no, like not very apologetic about it. The way that
No,
like Speer was.
Yeah.
Like Speer did a lot of bad stuff, but because he was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," they're like, "Well, we won't kill you."
Yeah,
that's fine.
I guess. I mean, that's sort of, and I think the fact that he was, I mean, the war in August of 41 is bad, but it doesn't, sort of a lot of, a lot of the real horrors of it hadn't really started yet, so they could sort of make the argument, well, like this person was like this just sort of stool pigeon who didn't do anything, and he just sort of sat on the sidelines. And in 1942 and 43 and 44, he's sitting in a prison in Britain.
I guess the fact that he like unilaterally decides to get in a plane and fly to Britain and jump out is kind of a sign of how unstable this guy might have actually been.
Yeah, exactly.
How not very suited to be in charge he might have been.
Yeah. Trying to think for other.
So Hess in charge, I guess, just to get off that tangent.
That'd be interesting. Don't even know that much about him other than what I've said. What else?
Another thing that could have changed the whole calculus of everything at the time of Barbarossa is if the Soviets had more success in Finland. I mean, this almost could be like its own little episode to itself. But like, as the Winter War, as it's called, the war between the Soviets and the Finns was like kind of a disaster. It was kind of a big wake-up call for the Soviets because they didn't have winter gear. They didn't use camouflage. They were using all these stupid tanks like T-35s, T-100s.
I like the T. Let's just comment on the T-35. I'm sure we'll have a good picture of it. But it is the most ridiculous. I love tanks. It is like one of the most ridiculous looking things you've ever seen. More turrets does not make it better.
More. We're going to make it out of Stalinium, the hardest metal known to man. No, but you got this big old boxcar. And at all four corners, you've got this big, round, like almost pillbox looking thing with a cannon sticking out of it. And then in the middle, there's like a great big cannon. And then like I think maybe like a machine gun mount that could swivel on its own as well. It's just a complete mess.
Turrets on turrets on turrets.
You told me you could. It's like in
Steel Panthers, which is a great game. It's an old game if you can still find it. You used to have to use MS-DOS prompt to operate it. It was amazing. CD/steel. You had to type in all the commands to do it. Yeah. But you can play it in, I think it's Steel Panthers World at War. The one that's the second one that's set in the Second World War. It was a newer one. And by newer, I mean like 15 years ago. But you can have those. And it's just like, this thing, it moves slow as hell. And the little turrets, they have puny guns in them. It doesn't matter. And it's also a huge target. It's really easy to hit because it's gigantic.
11 people were in that thing.
Yeah.
11.
It's just hard to imagine. And how do you coordinate 11 people efficiently like that, especially if they're in different turrets and moving all?
It's super loud inside. There's no radio.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing?
It's just sort of like, my God.
Or like the T-100 is like a double-decker tank. Let's make this profile super high and give it 2 crappy guns instead of 1 good one. So it can't...
The Russians have always been masters of quantity over quality.
They get very experimental with things. They do some crazy stuff. Another thing about the Finnish Winter War is the fact that that's where the Budanovka got retired.
Oh, yes.
The big, dumb conical cap that they used to wear.
But it looks so cool.
It looks like it makes the Soviets look like they're the henchmen of an evil wizard. That's what it looks like. So you know why? The reason they did that is because back in the days of like the Kievan Rus, their helmets had like these pointy things to them. And I guess the idea was that you're going to appeal to people's nationalism by giving them these dumb felt caps that don't protect you at all from winter and look super dumb.
Yeah. Well, the Winter War is fascinating too because it's just such a weird interlude. The Soviets actually won the Winter War. That's the thing, is that basically they did win. They got the territory that they wanted from the Finns.
Yeah.
Because their goal was never to conquer Finland. It was just to get this specific territory they demanded.
Yeah, Karelia.
The Karelian Isthmus and all that. But they won, but like they looked like fools in front of the whole world. And it's actually one of the reasons why the Germans felt even more comfortable with Barbarossa. Is they're like, the Soviets look terrible. And it showed fully how horrible the purges of the 30s had affected the Soviet military apparatus. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about Mikhail Tukhachevsky, if I'm pronouncing that correct. I'm sure someone will correct me. But he was sort of the guy who came up with what's called Soviet deep battle theory. So, and sort of considered probably the greatest genius of the Soviet army pre-World War II, but never got to see action because he got shot by the Soviets during the purges.
Oh, yeah, right.
I mean, Zhukov barely survived. Rokossovsky, who was actually one of the best tank commanders, I would say, of all time, was actually Polish originally. During the purges, he was taken to Lubyanka prison, which is like probably one of the most horrifying places you could be during the time. Tortured there. I think it was like all of his ribs were broken, or half of them were broken, and he was beaten so badly that he lost like half of his teeth. And I remember reading somewhere that he told his daughter that his daughter asked him once why he always kept a pistol on him. And he said, next time they come for me, like, I will not survive. Like, I'm either killing them or they're going to kill me, or I'll take my own life. But I will not be taken back to that place. And it shows you the dedication. This guy ended up being one of the finest tank commanders of the Second World War. He fought, he was at Kursk. I think one of his fronts was actually one of those that was heading into Berlin in the last days of the war. But quite a formidable person, but barely survived. I mean, only by a stroke of luck he wasn't executed.
And Zhukov, he was one of the very few who were not purged.
Yeah, and that allowed him to survive on and direct the war effort. But we'll get back to Zhukov in a minute because there's another thing we need to talk about on this involving Zhukov. But the Winter War. And also the Finnish, by losing the Winter War, really, really wanted to get back at the Soviets. And that's one of the reasons why the siege of Leningrad went on so long, is Leningrad was attacked from two angles. The Finns attacking down from their territory and the Germans driving up north, Army Group North.
On Lake Ladoga.
Yes. Well, yeah, Lake Ladoga's in between. So they had to, actually, at one point, the Soviets would drive trucks over the ice.
With their doors open, right? Just in case they started going through the ice, they could jump out at the last second.
Yeah. Crazy stuff. But that was a sort of lifeline that kept Leningrad going. But,
Leningrad, they would eat this thing called edible cellulose, a.k.a. sawdust.
Yes. Also people
as well.
Unfortunately. But a whole machine gun was invented during the siege of Leningrad.
What?
The PPS-43. It's this stainless steel monstrosity. It's like because everyone thinks of the Pepe Shah, the PPSH-41 is like the classic Soviet submachine gun of the Second World War. But the PPS-43 came about because they could make it in a musical instrument factory in Leningrad, and they're like, we need weapons, we can make this, and so it fired the 7.62 pistol round. But it's all stamped parts, so it looks like this crazy looking gun. But they could make it, and they ended up still using it somewhat after the war too. They sent it to a lot of client states. That's what the Soviets would do. They took the guns that they didn't really like and sent them to their client states. Just like the U.S. did too. In South Vietnam, we sent all these M1 Garands during the Vietnam War. They're like, here you go, take them.
Or not to mention all the Air Cobras we gave the Soviets during Land-Lease.
The Air Cobras and the P-63 King Cobra, the updated version of it.
King Cobra. Don't let the smooth taste fool you.
Oh, geez. But yeah, it's so. And then getting back to the Winter War thing. If the Soviets really won out in the Winter War, they'd probably be even more unprepared for Barbarossa because they did internally learn some lessons.
They learned a lot of lessons from that. Also, if they were able to occupy the entire country, the whole thing. I know they just wanted the little pieces of it, but if they were able to defeat the entire thing, they would then be sharing a border with Norway, which would then be occupied by the Nazis.
Germans,
And then what's going on there? Scandinavia is suddenly its own theater of the war.
Well, there was fighting that far up north. Very little. Yeah. Very little.
More of one. But go on.
Yeah, more of one. But then the one I want to get back to is Zhukov. Because talking about Zhukov reminds me of something we may have mentioned somewhat before, but is probably one of the most important battles of the Second World War, even though it wasn't technically fought during the Second World War, and almost no one in this country knows about it. And that's the Kulkin Gol. You know what I'm talking about, Max?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Well, I know you know what you're talking about.
Well, we talked about this earlier.
Yeah, we did talk about this earlier.
But Outer Mongolia up there.
And basically August of 1939, Japanese forces move out of Manchuria, or Manchukuo?
Manchukuo. Manchukuo.
Yeah, whatever. So move out of Manchuria, we'll just simplify it, into Mongolia, which at the time was basically part of the Soviet Union, was technically a Soviet client state at the time. There'd been fighting along the near the Ussuri River near Vladivostok the year before. There'd been some clashes, but this is sort of a full-scale Japanese invasion, not meant to meant to like sort of try and teach the Soviets a lesson. But the Soviets ended up teaching the Japanese a lesson, and it's probably one of the most formidable examples of it. Showed how well, and when tanks were used well, how much damage it could do. And they sort of routed the Japanese thoroughly. And the interesting thing about it is that not only did Zhukov then get recognition because of that, and he actually came on Stalin's radar in a good way.
Yeah.
Usually that's not a great thing. Usually being on his radar is not a good thing, but in his case it was. But it also is what led to the Japanese non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and allowed the Soviets to use troops on that front to fight back against the Germans.
Right.
Before the Soviets violated it in 1945 by invading.
Well,
Manchuria.
yeah, because they'd already beaten the Nazis, so they didn't really care anymore.
Yeah, at that point they didn't care.
The Japanese were going down, so who cares if you violated a treaty with them?
But what I'm saying is that if Khalkhin Gol goes differently, then the Soviets may have to keep a larger military presence on the border with Manchuria, and because of that, those troops are key that they use in December. Yeah. They can't bring those troops in. That's a big deal.
Or if like Zhukov was someplace else, and you have like Timoshenko or VK, I can't remember his name.
Clement Voroshilov.
KV.
KV.
Yeah,
Name that KV tank. Look up a KV2 and tell me if that's not as good a profile for an anti-tank gun as you could have imagined. It almost says "shoot me" on it.
Well, it blends in with the commie blocks. You see, with that nice square shape looming over the horizon.
Makes for a really good target. Remember, that's when you build a tank, you want to build high profile, highest profile you possibly can imagine. Don't slope the armor whatsoever. Make it vertical.
And put like 2 or 3 guys in that turret. Just jam them up in there. It's perfect.
No radio either. That's a bad idea. We don't need that. We'll just communicate with hand signals.
Radios are dumb. Yikes.
Which it makes it incredible to think how much thrown together and how brave Soviet tankers were, because at the beginning of the war, only a platoon commander in a Soviet tank division would have like a radio in his vehicle. All the other vehicles didn't have radios. That was like the big thing the Germans did that they had over other countries, is they had all their tanks had radios in them, and eventually obviously the Allies followed up on that. But I mean, could you imagine that? Like trying to signal your other tanks with hand signals in the middle of a battle? A semaphore. The middle of a tank battle. I mean,
God, I can't even imagine. That's insane. It's insane.
That's hard to believe that it got to that point. Like, in a World War I tanks, they had to use hand signals to communicate with each other because it was so deafeningly loud because the engine wasn't in a separate compartment that you could scream all you want, but no one would be able to hear you. So you just have to use hand signals, and they do that in the Great War books. In
that Battlefield 1 game, this seems like it can't possibly be true, but they like send messages via carrier pigeon. It's like, we've got orders, and then they throw it out the window.
Yes.
That really
carrier
happens?
Pigeons were really used in World War II.
That's insane. That's so ridiculous.
Use smoke signals.
When was the radio invented?
Well, wireless. There was a form of wireless communication.
Wireless telegraph, yeah.
In World War I. The radio itself, really the 20s, I guess.
Okay.
Like as we know it, yeah. I think.
That's that thing that they do in the Great War books is let's
wireless.
The wireless.
Yeah, the
Tune
wireless.
to the wireless.
Listen about those barrels. Make a flabble about it.
Let's listen to Will Rogers on the wireless.
Yeah, from Sequoia.
From the state of Sequoia. I love that. I love that stuff.
But the Eastern Front's just a fascinating place. We may have to do another episode on like the later parts of the war, because the Eastern Front is so vast, and I've talked about this in other episodes, I know, but it's something that's really underappreciated in the United States, because a lot of us seem to think World War II in Europe was like there was like Germany declared war on us, and then there was like something going on in North Africa, we think, and then there was D-Day, and then we skipped straight from Normandy beaches straight to Bastogne, and then like there was the end of the war.
It is almost like a paradox, because like these small battles in which not that many people died, like comparatively, like Alamein, for instance, have
Mm-hmm.
like this huge significance, and people like think they're. Well, I mean, of course, they're very important strategically,
yeah.
but I mean, like these battles with not a lot of death toll.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, like, first, second, third Kharkov battle, people don't know anything about.
I mean, Kharkov switched hands God knows how many times in the early months of 43. I mean, Stalingrad, in glance in that lecture, I'm not going to be able to pull up the exact details, but he talked about, like, he was talking about at that point in the Iraq War or Afghanistan, like the total number of American soldiers killed. And he said, like, that number is what a Soviet rifle division going into Stalingrad in late 42 would expect to lose in like a week killed. I mean, he's talked about some division that went into Stalingrad. He said it had like 7,500 men. I don't know the exact numbers. Pull up the lecture, and he has the exact the unit number and all that. Went in with 7,500 men roughly into Stalingrad, and a month later they walked out with 62. I mean, that's the type of casualties. I mean, the Red October factory itself changed hands like 70 times during the battle. I mean, you have to realize that the war on the Eastern Front is a war more than just, it's a war unlike any other because there's a racial component too. I mean, the Germans, as the Germans are pushing forward, they have Einsatzgruppen that are slaughtering Jews everywhere they go. I mean, and this is prior to the Wannsee conferences in January of 1942. In June of 1941, you have German death squads shooting Jews everywhere they can find them, slaughtering non-Jews as well, Slavs, I mean, if you were a political commissar in the Communist Party, if you were captured, your orders were to be shot on sight.
Yeah.
I mean, the way Ukrainians were treated, the way Belarusians, I mean, just the horrible way, I mean, that the Germans are treating people. And that's why the Soviets fought so hard, is they knew that basically they're facing extinction or slavery. That's why the Russians called it the Great Patriotic War. This had an impact on them in a level that we can't even, I mean, 1 million people died during the siege of Leningrad. Over 1 million people died during the Battle of Stalingrad. Kursk, the scale of these battles, the scale of Barbarossa, something like Glantz talks about it again in this lecture. Go listen to it if you really want to. I mean, it is dense, but I mean, the length, he talks about the length of the Eastern Front is something from like Maine to Florida. Like that's the length of it. Like, and the depth of the line would go from the eastern seaboard of the United States to like Kansas City. I mean, it just the scope and scale of this. And I think here in the U.S., we're getting better about some attention on it. I mean, obviously they made like Enemy at the Gates, which was, wasn't...
It has some problems.
Okay, yeah, it does.
Yeah. Ron Perlman. No, I'm joking.
But he was in Blade 2, Max.
He was in Blade 2.
Fantastic.
He was my favorite part of Blade 2. No, that's not true. Well, of course, Wesley Snipes is my favorite one. And then Whistler's my second favorite. And then my third favorite is probably Norman Reedus, I guess.
So he's really like your fourth favorite part.
That's my fourth favorite part of Blade 2. But man, I mean, that's...
I want to hear your list of what's your fourth favorite part of Blade Trinity.
Oh, boy. Probably my fourth favorite part is when the vampire dog fell out the window. That was all right. That was mildly amusing. My favorite character in Blade 2 was a priest.
We could just kill everybody in here. Not even half of these people are pure bloods, are they?
What a film. Good job, Guillermo del Toro.
Donnie Yen.
Yeah. He should make a movie about the Eastern Front. He
think
did make a film set during the Spanish Civil War.
That's right, Pan's Labyrinth.
Pan's
All that
Labyrinth.
stuff really happened.
No, did it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if he makes a movie about the Eastern Front, I'm expecting all the tanks to have eyes.
That'd be cool. Like a fantasy world. Turtledove did a fantasy World War II with like dragons and stuff.
No, geez.
He
I'm not
did.
big into fantasy, guys. I'm just going to preface that.
Yeah.
So that would, yeah.
I'm not holding it. Oh no, you don't want to read the Turtledove World War II fantasy book? Oh no.
I'm a monster.
I think eventually I'll try reading that World War thing, but I'm a little worried. I'm a little concerned.
The one with the aliens?
The one with
No, I
the
can touch that.
reptilian
Nope.
aliens in it.
Go back to like the first 15 seconds of our Bad Alternate History episode, and you will hear why. Nope, we're not touching that. Not touching aliens.
Not a big alien guy.
Yeah, if I wanted to read sci-fi, I would.
But you don't.
But I don't. So I won't. But no. But going back to it is that the Eastern Front deserves more attention is what I'm saying. Read about Operation Bagration. I mean, we'll cover that in another episode. But I mean...
Do you know that's named after a general during the Napoleonic War?
General Bagration.
Yeah.
Mikhail Bagration?
Something like that. Do you know that I wish I could remember his name, but the Russians had a Scottish general during the Napoleonic Wars. It's like...
What? Was he like a mercenary?
He was half Scottish, half like Baltic German or Russian or something like that. It's interesting. It's interesting how they used to do it.
Yeah, you bring up Baltic Germans, which is interesting. That like in the Battle of Tannenberg in the First World War, or the Great War, the First Great War. Let's start doing that as a thing.
The First Great War.
First Great War and Second Great War.
Second Great War, yeah.
The Korean Great War.
Right. The Third Great War, the Congo Crisis.
Yes,
of course.
One of the generals of one of the Russian armies at Tannenberg had like a German name. And that always threw me off when I saw it. I was like, is that a misprint? No, it's not.
No.
No.
Ernst von Sternberg.
Yeah.
Russian.
Yeah. Baltic Germans don't really exist anymore.
Yeah.
But
Stalin fixed that?
They're mostly relocated.
Khrushchev fixed that.
Yeah, they were in the 40s. I think they're mostly relocated to East Germany.
Okay.
But we talked about that in the European revolutions one, about how there was like Baltic Germans. So mainly in Latvia and Estonia, not really in Lithuania, except in Memel, that city.
Memel. We got an email from an Estonian listener.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Would like us to talk more about Estonia.
Well, here you go.
Here it is. It's happening.
Baltic Germans.
I
mean, that's the thing too, is that we've seen in the wake of the Second World War is that there used to be diasporas of people speaking different languages spread all over. There was the Baltic Germans. There was the Volga Germans.
Mm-hmm. There was Germans in Hungary, weren't there?
Yes, there was Transylvanian Saxons.
Mm-hmm.
There was Germans in Hungary and in Romania. But then you had people like Ukrainians spread in at that time was Eastern Poland, which is now like southern Belarus. You had Polish-speaking people spread out way farther east than you'd think for today. The German diaspora. There's Germans in northern Italy, in Trent, like
Tyrol or whatever.
In the sort of. It was the southern Tyrol, I guess. So, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before it was ceded to Italy. But you go up to like Trento. Trent, I guess, is what we call it, like the Council of Trent. Mm-hmm. Like that area is primarily like heavily German. And it's Italy. I mean, you see, what I'm trying to say is that there used to be there was a lot of ethnic like movement after the war. Most of it forcible, but a lot of what you see is that there used to be these language groups spread out way farther than you'd think. People speaking these languages spread all over the freaking place. Yeah. So the Germans were notorious, I think, for that, for spreading out like that. But it's just interesting to see how like those have changed over time, and a lot of it was forcible relocation in the Second World War.
Right.
You go to a place like
displaced persons.
Yeah, exactly. Like Posen, Prussia, is Poznan, Poland. Wroclaw, Gdansk was Danzig, and Danzig was a German city primarily, very heavily. Then you have Wroclaw, Poland it used to be a German city because of Silesia. Stettin, Germany, is now like Szez. Polish has a lot of Z's in it sometimes. Just put up a picture of the X.
At least they use the Roman alphabet, which I very much appreciate. Mm-hmm. The Romanians do as well.
They do.
Thank you.
Romance language spoken in the middle of Eastern Europe.
Pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people with "ku" at the end of their name.
Yeah, Ceausescu,
for instance. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Barbarossa. Named after, we should talk about who it's named after.
The emperor.
Frederick Barbarossa. The Third Crusade had three leaders. Richard the First of England, the Lionheart, King Philip of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. And Barbarossa was going to lead the land. So Philip and Richard came by boat, their armies, but the much larger army would march by land. And Emperor Barbarossa would bring that. And it actually came into Byzantine territory and was marching in Turkey when he went for a swim in a river.
An
in
involuntary
his
swim.
No. I can't remember if he fell or he just went for a swim, but he hadn't taken his armor off, so he drowned in a river and his armor turned around and went back. Yeah. But that's who it is, Barbarossa.
Good old Barbarossa. Good old Redbeard.
Redbeard, that's what it means, Redbeard. And that's why in the Turtle Dove books, when the Confederates attack in World War II, it's Operation Blackbeard.
Blackbeard.
Harry, you sly dog, you.
Activate Operation Blackbeard.
Good stuff. And that's in the last mid-war in the last American Empire book. That's like the ending before they start off with settling accounts.
Yeah.
Here's something to think about is the fact that if like Poland was voluntarily part of the Axis, some kind of like an interesting caveat of that is that Jews in Poland would probably been a lot safer than they were in occupied, like conquered Poland.
Yeah, the general government of Poland was one of the most horrendous governments you could ever imagine. I mean,
yeah,
something like 17% of like Poland's population died during the Second World War. I think only Belarus had a higher percentage of people die.
Yeah,
and many of those parts of Belarus were parts of Poland, Eastern Poland. So,
but if you had like more of like a Romania or Hungary under Admiral Horthy kind of thing, like maybe they would have been safer. I don't know.
Safer, but remember too that huge numbers of Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz in 1944 by the Germans too.
But that was after the Arrow Cross took over, isn't it? Or is that not true? I thought Horthy...
Yeah, well, pretty much at that point, the Germans had occupied it.
They like couped it and kicked him out, which is funny that you have an admiral ruling your country that has no water.
Admiral Horthy was an admiral in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which did have a coast, albeit not a whole lot of it. But yes, I have noted that too, where it's like Hungary is a landlocked country. It's got Lake Balaton. That's about it. Yeah. But do you also know that Budapest used to be two cities, or really is kind of two cities?
I've been to Budapest.
That's right. I have not.
I've seen bullet holes from when there was fighting in the city.
Buda and Pest.
Buda and Pest. Yeah. Well,
but yeah, I've really enjoyed talking about this, Max. But remember, guys, if you ever have any questions or comments or any suggestions for an episode, you can reach out to us at talkernatehistory@gmail.com. We always like hearing from you.
Yes.
So this is Matt signing off.
And this is Max signing off.
Have a good day, guys.